I've devoted my entire life to this. The eternal engine. It is eternity itself. It's for you, Curtis. I am old. I want you to take my station. It's what you always wanted. It's what Gilliam wanted too. You must tend the engine. Keep her humming. Look, Curtis. Beyond the gate. Section after section, precisely where they've always been and where they'll always be, all adding up to what? The train. And now the perfectly correct number of human beings, all in their proper places, all adding up to what? Humanity. The train is the world. We the humanity. And now you have this sacred responsibility to lead all of humanity. Without you, Curtis, humanity will cease to exist. You've seen what people do without leadership. They devour one another.
Not gonna happen. Oh, you demiurge. Played once again by Ed Harris. Oh, you white whale, you cosmocrator. We're not taking over the eternal engine. We're not becoming like you. We're doing things differently here. And where is here?
This is blasphemy! This is madness!
Aeon by Gnostic Radio. This is where heresy shouldn't be this much fun, but it just is. It just bloody well is. The Gnostic-minded Robert Frost partly summarized why heresy is so much fun when he said, "Forgive, O Lord, my little jokes on thee, and I'll forgive thy great big one on me." More important, this is the greatest adventure you'll ever find yourself in. The one of Gnosis, knowing who you really are and what reality is really not. Unlike the introduction from Snowpiercer you just heard, to ensure you don't sell out to the powers and principalities and become just another chief archon in the sound and fury signifying nothing.
As Hemingway said, there is nothing noble in being superior to your fellow man. True nobility is being superior to your former self.
We don't take prisoners but liberate them. We are not the final authority on anything, but hope to be an endless possibility for everything. We are not for any cause, but only causing your inner alchemical transformation into the best version of yourself. We are spiritual wasabi. We're raging against heaven and storming the gates of hell for our misplaced childhoods and paradises lost. Divided we stand, together we rise, losing our minds and coming to our senses. We spiritual entrepreneurs, Johnny Cash Bodhisattvas, ascended masters and masturbators, and modern-day Tom Sawyers, our mind not for rent by any god or government. Like the protagonist in the film A Knight's Tale, we know we can change our stars like the ancient Gnostics did. Snap the seductions of the crack whore called fate. Enter into complete liberation.
Do you believe in fate, Neil?
No,
Why not?
because I don't like the idea that I'm not in control of my life.
I am Abraxas in his meat puppet incarnation of Miguel Connor.
Like every single preacher, priest, and holy man since the dawn of time is full of shit. The only true God, the only real God, is the God of meat.
Broadcasting from the lawful but frigid dystopia of Chicago, patiently waiting for the beginning of the world. I am your Pompatus of Gnosis. You've got a fever and believe you're just human, and the only prescription is that Aeon Sophia cowbell.
I gotta have more cowbell.
On this September, the year of our Demiurge 2016, we have the infernal honor of being joined again by my friend, publisher, and mentor, Andrew Philip Smith. He materializes at the virtual Alexandria to discuss his latest book, John the Baptist and the Last Gnostics, The Secret History of the Mandaeans. It's a riveting, third-eye-opening interview that covers Mandean history, religion, and the present dire plight in the solar lands of Allah, the Arabic incarnation of Yaldabaoth. Andrew has put out yet another important book that will grant you a new perspective on this ancient Gnostic sect and Gnosticism in general.
It's just one story. The oldest.
What's that?
Light versus dark.
I mean, Mandean means Gnostic. They promote the concept of gnosis, and if you read their myths from Andrew's book, you'll find a cosmology that could comfortably fit in the Nag Hammadi library, or come from the mouth of the prophet Mani. Furthermore, it's fascinating how the Mandaeans, like the Sethians, deconstruct and inverse Abrahamic and even traditional Gnostic figures, like making Jesus and Sophia into the bad guys, maybe even with English accents, breaking up the Demiurge into different characters, rooting for the Egyptians against Moses, and more, while still maintaining that humans are lost divine shards of an alien god or undocumented deity, deluded into thinking we're human and that our greatest goal is to take over the eternal engine of Jehovah in the ultimate sellout.
Billions of people just living out their lives, oblivious.
The perfect world was a dream that your primitive cerebrum kept trying to wake up from.
To complement this show, please check out our interview with Professor Nathaniel Deutsch on the Mandaeans, found, along with all of Andrew's past interviews, at our archive of past shows, or our iTunes, YouTube, and Stitcher channels. For more information on Andrew, please visit andrewphillipsmith.com, and that is Philip with 2 L's. And of course, you will find out more about yourself and what reality is not in the interview, like all the ones at Aeon Byte. I like this quote from John the Baptist and the Last Gnostics that summarizes the plight of all of us true seeker warriors fighting that eternal engine. If Gnosticism is a religion of the underdog, always in need of a numerical advantage, dominating oppressor, which worships the wrong god, the false god in distinction to the great life of the Mandaeans, then Mandeanism surely must qualify on that count. Perpetually in the shadow of world religions, world events, of empires and tyrants in global politics, the Mandeans truly are the last Gnostic religion. Let us hope that the dogged, long-lived Mandaeans, the last surviving group of ancient Gnostics, are still baptizing and worshiping the great life in another 2,000 years.
Yes, these are bruises from fighting. Yes, I'm comfortable with that. I am enlightened.
We are the underdogs. We are legend. We are the Gnostics. We will never submit to taking over or even accepting the eternal engine.
We live, we fight, and we die for each other.
Please support Aeon Byte in any way you can. A few shekels here and there. Any assistance you might have, like graphic design or sacrifices to Moloch, would be appreciated. Join my Patreon campaign, Amazon wishlist, or affiliate program. All manner of avenues to supporting this red pill cafeteria you can find at thegodabovegod.com. Or just shoot me an email at Miguel at thegodabovegod.com. We're breaking records in 2016 in terms of traffic and listeners. But overhead is exploding, and I need your Samson strength to keep the pillars of the virtual Alexandria up and John Holmes erect. Don't forget, you can support by buying some of me mind-expanding, reality-dispending books, or even just some good reviews at iTunes or YouTube. We're gonna do so many wonders together, build vast futures of light. I just know it. I just know it. Much appreciation to you veterans of 1,000 psychic wars who support this blasphemy on a weekly basis.
If we have souls, they are made of the love we share. Undimmed by time, unbound by death.
Led us to the interview with Andrew Philip Smith on John the Baptist and the Last Gnostics. Keep your eye on some very cool gods and demons you've probably never heard of that really would be useful in this batshit crazy universe run by batshit crazy angels that are often just ourselves, or maybe Ed Harris. Write your own gospel, live your own myth.
Animals are innocent. Why should they suffer? Why should children suffer? Will you tell me that? Why should any baby have to suffer and die?
Why should men?
Oh, come on now. Don't try that one on me. You've got answers for it. Like pain makes people noble. And how could man be more than a talking, tennis-playing panda bear if it weren't at least for the possibility of suffering? But what about animals, Hud? Does pain make turkeys noble? Why is all of creation based on dog eat dog, and the little fish are eaten by the big fish? Animals screaming in pain. All of creation an open wound, a fucking slaughterhouse.
We've talked about that.
Not enough!
We said original sin might be the cause.
Then why doesn't Foot just come down and tell us? Is Foot running short of tablets of stone? My Uncle Eddie owns a quarry. I'll get them for you. Wholesale.
This is the Aeon Byte interview, and with us we definitely have the pleasure of being joined again by Andrew Philip Smith to discuss his new book, John the Baptist and the Last Gnostics, The Secret History of the Mandaeans. How are you doing today, Andrew?
Hi, Miguel. Well, very happy to be on the show. I'm still a little bit sick and about 3/4 deaf, but at least I can speak now. So.
Oh, that's okay. Before I did an interview with Gary Lockman about a week ago, and I was the one who was sick. So Gary was able to carry us through it. So I'll carry you through this secret history.
Okay, I bet you're manning up more than I am. I'm a whinging European. So.
We'll get through this. So why don't we start with, of course, so when it comes to the Mandeans, the $64,000 question, which is their origins. How old is this Gnostic sect? Tell us what you find out or where you stand these days.
Well, that's what the whole book is about, really, following their history back to their possible or likely origins. So you're basically asking me to give you spoilers on the book. But the Mandaeans, well, the Mandaeans' own view of their origins is that John the Baptist was more or less their last prophet, but he wasn't the founder of their religion. They existed long before that, and that they were living around Jerusalem and that general area, and then they migrated to the countries where they now live, Iraq and Iran, and that they stopped off at various places and of course the scholarly analysis of Mandaeans has, probably since the 19th century, connected them with Gnosticism. So if they are a kind of Gnostic religion, then they should have some historical connection with the ancient Gnostics, you know. So the whole question of Gnosticism of the last 20 years has been dissected and deconstructed, although it's making a bit of a comeback again. And I was surprised to see how Gnostic they really are, because when I started looking into the Mandaeans, just as part of my general investigations into Gnosticism, I was pretty skeptical, first of all, that they would have gone back to the times of the ancient Gnostics, and that they had a connection with John the Baptist. I think when I first came across them, probably about 15, 20 years ago, I thought, well, I've been reading a lot of New Testament scholarship. When you do that, you find out that, the Gospels weren't written by eyewitnesses. They don't even claim to be, for the most part, to be written by the people who appear in the title, like the Gospel of Mark. Nobody really thinks it's written by Mark unless you're a fundamentalist conservative Christian, So I saw that the Mandaeans go back to John the Baptist, and I thought, oh well, it's just one of those things. Everybody was staking a claim, taking the name of some figure and attaching it to them. And it's only more recently that I thought, I started thinking that, there's always the possibility that this could be the case. And in terms of the scholarship, though, through the 20th century, there haven't been an awful lot of scholars working on it. There have been some very distinctive people like Lady Drower and Kurt Rudolph and Joran Buckley.
Edmund Lupieri.
Lupieri as well, yeah. But anyway, so we don't have masses and masses of people working on this stuff and departments in every university and all that kind of thing. So the points of view take over a bit, and then they very slowly get refuted as a new generation gets interested in the stuff. So we've had scholars proposing that the Mandaeans don't go back further than the arrival of Islam in Mesopotamia, or that they're Mesopotamian, or that they're a Mesopotamian heretical Jewish group or whatever. And although Lady Drow was definitely an exception, there's been a lot of resistance to seeing them as genuinely having anything to do with John the Baptist. As I came to become sort of less skeptical about this, I looked at the story of the Mandaeans. They go back to John the Baptist. They've been in Iraq since they migrated in the 1st century from Judean area, or the Jordan area, and that they survived all that time. People try to link them to the Knights Templar. They've often claimed to be the Sabians described in the Quran, all this kind of stuff. And I thought, this sounds like an alternative history story. It'd be difficult for anybody to kind of come up with such a weird history. But although it sounds like an alternative history, that this is what scholarship has been discussing. Academic scholarship has been discussing. So my idea was kind of to write something that had a bit of the feel of an alternative history book, but to use very reliable information in investigating all this stuff. And I love alternative history books. Some of them probably do reveal things that have been ignored by mainstream historians and so on. But a lot of them are full of wild inaccuracies, and as I'm sure every time you get an alternative history book mentions the Gnostics, it's usually pretty off base what they're saying. If we have some expertise in that area, so those are the bits that we recognise. Anyway, and then as I was writing the book, I started realising that Mandaeans are living people, although in a great deal of trouble, and it's a living religion. So I don't want to go off on real flights of fantasy myself, and I don't want to misrepresent them. And that was kind of important when I'm discussing monotheism and dualism, because Gnostic religions are generally classified as dualist. It's not usually their own classification; it's an academic classification. Still, there we are. But Mandaeans in Iraq, have been suffering persecution and it's still going on, I think, to a slightly lesser extent. So their claim to be monotheists is very important to them. And in a recent English translation of the Ginza, they have a section saying monotheism, right at the beginning of the Ginza. I wanted to address things like that. It is a form of monotheism, as is, most Gnosticism, really. They posit a single source, which is the true God, and that's the God that you're trying to return to and you can try and have a connection with and everything. There may be a competing force of darkness, as in Manichaeism or in Mandaeism as well. But you're not worshipping that force of darkness. You're not trying to unite with that force of darkness. You're not trying to descend down to the force of darkness. You're trying to ascend to the world of light and to the the one principle, the one true principle that's there. So at one point I was thinking, if a jihadi or member of ISIS or something got their whole hands on this book, I want them to know that you should be tolerating Mandaeans as a monotheistic religion.
Yeah, agreed. And it's very unfortunate about their persecution. And we can get back to that. But let's talk about their Gnostic characteristics. And your book makes a very good case for it. It also has a lot of very interesting and resourceful information. One thing about the Mandeans that even those who study Gnosticism might not know is their view on astrology, on the stars. That's very close to the ancient Sethians, isn't it?
It is, yes, very much so. Typically in ancient Gnosticism, astrology is seen as fate in a negative way. It's something that you have to liberate yourself from. Which connects with the the sort of planetary spheres that you can ascend through, and the idea of Hadmalmene, fate in this negative context, and that's very much what you see in the kind of official side of Mandaean religion. And the Mandaeans, although I don't think they came from Mesopotamia, Iraq and Iran originally, that's where they were when the religion was developing and really forming. And there are lots of Mesopotamian influences on them. And Mesopotamia, as we know, is the home of astrology. Astrology went on to Egypt, and the kind of astrology that we know took shape in the Hellenistic world. But the Chaldean astrology, as it still gets called sometimes, was really a product of Mesopotamia. So we see that in the Mandaean scriptures, and we see these Mesopotamian figures of planetary gods and goddesses cropping up in the Mandaean scriptures, usually in pretty negative ways. We even see Jesus being identified with the Mesopotamian Mercury, as a kind of trickster figure in that way. So there's that definite linkage, and that's in the official religion. Now, Mandaeans have been a religious ethnic group for getting on for 2,000 years, I think. And of course, in that time, the folk religion and the practices of the common people often veer away from the official religion. So astrology is I have no idea to what extent it still is, but right up into the 20th century it was very popular with Mandaeans. They did cast horoscopes, and there's a whole business of finding your true name, which is based on your time of birth, and what's known as the Book of the Zodiac, which has lists of names which are assigned to a number that's calculated from the time and day of your birth. So we do see both sides, and I think Lady Drower suggested that just as in Mesopotamian tradition, planetary deities might have positive and negative aspects to them. So in the sort of official Mandaean religion, you see the negative aspects. but in sort of day-to-day astrological practices, which are, as with many forms of magical practice, are concerned with practical things, with your ensuring your day-to-day well-being and of you and your family, and to do with health and wealth and all that sort of thing. In practice, Mandaeans became skilled astrologers, and many. I mean, I know a tiny bit about astrology, but I'm not an astrologer myself. It'd be interesting to see what one of these cutting-edge modern astrologers might make of the Mandaean systems, which include the 36 decans and other archaic aspects of astrology.
Another fascinating connection is that in the Mandean lore, when Adam is created, he crawls like a worm, and that's like straight out of the Secret Book of John or the Hypostasis of the Archons.
It is, yes. That was really, that's one of those moments that, you end up scratching your head and thinking, okay, there is something to this about the Mandaeans being related to the ancient Gnostics, And I had a similar moment with when I was doing the Cathars book with exactly the same thing, with the Bogomils and Cathars, you see the same story about, Adam's, like a worm, and he can't get off the ground until he's assisted by the higher powers. And there are some other things like that. Of course, the baptism itself is a possible linkage to Sethian practices, and generally to first century Jewish, in the broader sense, baptismal practices. Because the Valentinians, of course, they had the different sacraments, which were quite closely linked to the sacraments of the emerging Catholic Church. But and of course the Mandaeans are primarily defined by their weekly baptisms. Every time you see an image of the Mandaeans, it's so dramatic. The old white-bearded priests in their white robes with the staff and the other paraphernalia, dunking the white-robed worshippers in the running river, all that kind of stuff. That's very much part of the image of the Mandaeans. But when you think of the Sethians or the Valentinians, I tend to think of them sitting in rooms discussing stuff. But John Turner in particular has made some connections between the five seals baptism of the Sethians and the kind of thing that you see in Mandaean literature. So, when you have an image of the Sethians, rather than thinking of them, having a Torah scroll in front of them, which they rip into shreds, or turning upside down, and discussing this, that, and the other, or, sitting in a chair having an ascent of the soul,
Right.
Maybe sometimes we have to think of them, maybe either in a pool being baptized or out by the river being baptized as well, So, that's one of those things that sort of opens up the images that we have of ancient Gnosticism as well. By studying the Mandaeans, we can see perhaps what the Sethians, the Valentinians, and so on might have become if they'd survived.
People forget that the Gnostics were looking for an experience, so there had to be praxis. So it makes perfect sense. Like you said, they weren't just talking themselves into a mystical state. But going a bit more into their myths, Andrew, it seems their view of the demiurge is more or less spread out, although, as you argue and I feel, is still very Gnostic. I mean, where do we find the demiurge in the Mandean myth?
Well, if you look at the Mandaean myth, it reminds you of Gnostic myths, like reading Hans Jonas. They all kind of merge into one because he's quoting from Mandaean sources, Manichaean sources, and the Gnostic sources that he had there. And it seems little question that it's kind of resembles a Gnostic myth. So in the Mandaean myth, you have the first life or the great life at the beginning, and then you have these Uthri, which is the plural of Uthra, kind of emanating out from him. And they have various names, Abathur, and then the final one is Tahil. And there are 4 levels. And my editor, actually, my copy editor, was having terrible trouble with this. So, okay, an Uthra is like a spiritual being, but the first life, the second life, the third life, and the fourth life, they're also, each of those is an Uthra. And an Uthra is also a kind of realm as well, And the copy editor, a good copy editor, is often very literal-minded because they're trying to, looking for inconsistencies and everything. I was driving my copy editor mad trying to explain, well, it's all these at once, Sounds very strange to us, but a realm could be a being, and there could be other beings in that realm which had the same kind, which were a similar kind of being to the being that comprises the whole realm, which is within another realm above it, and has another realm below it, which is also a being. It's very doesn't have much in common with Western logical rationalist thinking at all. It's very much mythical thinking. So we have these realms, and then Tahil is instructed to create the material world. And as always, in a Gnostic myth, if you make a material world, whether you do it by purpose or on accident, it goes wrong. And the world of darkness, which up to then hasn't been mentioned, gets involved with the material world. And we have these various figures like Mandaean, who's something of a savior figure, and his name means knowledge of life. So it's connected with the concept of gnosis. Has to descend down into the worlds of darkness, where he discovers these beings, Ruha, who's a kind of demonic female being, whose name is cognate with the Hebrew Ruach, meaning soul. And then like Krum, Krum, who's a great mountain of flesh, who's a pretty nasty character.
Oh, yeah. Ooh, something out of Lovecraft.
Yeah, there was a competition a few years ago to name a newly discovered moon on one of the outer planets of the solar system, and they wanted a mythological name. So some Mandaeans submitted Krum as the name for this new moon that had been discovered. Unfortunately, I don't think it was chosen, but it would have been great to have a moon named after a Mandaean demon. So, as always with these stories, the Mandaean myth isn't very neat and tidy, and even in the Ginza, the different versions of it and different implications and everything. But as you're mentioning, it's not like we have Yabal-Da'oth as a single demiurgic character who has most of the blame attached to him, as well as credit for making the material world. Two of the Uthri, who represent the third life and the fourth life, have some responsibility for the material world, and it's kind of spread out. And then you have the figure of Ruha, who is this feminine figure who is somewhat to blame for what's going on, but there are indications in some of the myths and some of the folktale versions that she can actually be redeemed herself, which would make her a much more of a Sophia figure. So it's complex stuff and not very systematic, but these things carried on as living myths, and you can find in Lady Drow's accounts of talking to Mandaeans in the 20th century that they were retelling these myths and changing them a bit in kind of folktale versions, and they were still very much living currency then. And there are other kind of savior figures who come down to help humanity, like Hibil Ziwa, whose name actually is a Mandaean version of Abel, and Shitil, who is Seth, which again connects, with the sort of Gnostic Sethian influence there. And again, those are figures that in the living religion can assist you. Yoren Buckley described how when she's befriended Mandaeans in various parts of the country and assisted Mandaean refugees coming to the USA and other countries. And she describes how she was in a car with a Mandaean friend of hers, and the car broke down, or it wouldn't start, and he appealed to Hibil Ziwa to help him with the car, which there's almost no other example of a living Gnostic religion. You can see the kind of things that happen on the ground. The sort of everyday practices of appealing to a Gnostic savior figure. We have the kind of the Gnostic revival and everything, but of course you don't have that kind of folk religion aspect that develops over centuries as you do with the Mandaeans.
Your book certainly brings, definitely has you present a very rich tapestry of their myths. And again, for anybody who likes mythology or religion, Andrew really shows some great examples. You just talked about our friend Krun, the great hill of flesh who has no bones, who makes a very great villain. But another fascinating character is that of, and I'm sure I'm going to say it wrong, Dinakut or Dinanuk or something like that, who's a being who is half man and half book. That talk about a great modern god for our millennial hipster generation.
Yeah, I think it's Dinanuk, but I've actually never heard anybody say it in practice.
So you're with a Mandean in a car.
Yeah, and I think Mandaic is an Aramaic language. Qualifies as dialect of Aramaic, and it's a Semitic language. But I think the ch sound has disappeared in Mandaean, so that's why it's ruha, just with an H rather than ruach, as in the Hebrew. But yes, I mean that's kind of he's a great character, and there's also an image of him that you can find, and the Mandaeans, in their scriptures, they have this very strange artistic style. It's almost kind of cubist. It looks like something that some esoteric artist from the 20th century would have come up with. Very blocky, with Mandaean letters written in and everything. And so there's one which seems to be an image of Dianut reading himself. And wouldn't it be great to read yourself in that way? The story is actually in the Ginza, which is the main compendium, or treasury, as it literally means, of Mandaean scriptures. And I really don't know what to make about the story itself. He meets a smaller book called Desai, who it tries to drown and burn. That could refer to competing scriptures, I suppose, representing some other religion who have always been threats throughout the length of Mandaean history. But I think he's a figure that has to be brought back to life, and I hope modern Mandaeans have some consciousness of him.
We could create a new myth where the Kindle is the demiurge, and this figure has to fight him to save our society.
Maybe the Kindle is the lesser book that he's trying to drown and burn.
Yes, again, a living religion should continue, and as you point out in your book, the Mandeans simply are taking or sort of riffing off the ancient Gnostics of always just deconstructing and changing their own myths to suit the times or to suit the experience of the individual. And of course, in Mandeanism, we have the figure of Jesus, and like other figures in their myth, like Sophia, who is Ruha, they like to invert things. Again, a very Gnostic tendency. So tell the listener a little bit about how the Mandeans view Jesus.
Well, again, this is something. I do want to emphasize that modern Mandaeans feel a lot of commonality with Christians, who are in the minority as well in Iraq and Iran, along with the Mandaeans, and that I don't think modern Mandaeans have any beef with Christianity or Christians. However, it is one of the fascinating aspects of Mandaeism that Jesus is basically an apostate Mandaean. So they say that John the Baptist was their prophet, And in these various stories set in the 1st century, in and around Jerusalem, Jesus goes to John the Baptist and he wants to get baptized, and John doesn't want to do it because he doesn't trust Jesus. And then, there's some jiggery-pokery going on from the realms above, and John sort of gets persuaded into it. And of course, Jesus goes and he doesn't keep the proper Mandaean rituals, and he goes off and makes stuff up and everything like that. And as a result, Jerusalem is destroyed, and the Mandaeans go off and migrate to Iraq and Iran and other places. But it's the only example of a religion that's classified as Gnostic where Jesus has this inversionary process applied to him. Moses is a figure, somewhat a figure of enmity, and like in Sathian writings, it is not as Moses said, and Noah can be the good guy or the bad guy, and of course, the biggest figure for inverse exegesis is Jehovah himself in the garden, who's the stupid, evil demiurge who doesn't recognize anything above himself. But with the Mandaeans, yes, that's unique that we have that with Jesus. And Jesus gets identified with, I'm trying to remember the name of the mercurial planetary god in the Mandaean sources. Is it Nebu, or cognate with Nergal, the Mesopotamian god? But so he gets identified with this mercurial figure. It's not a massive part of the scriptures, really, but it is there, and it kind of makes people uneasy as well.
Yeah,
and I'm
least.
Sure, modern Mandaeans might wish it wasn't there, But I was talking about this with Gerard Russell, who I interviewed for an issue of the Gnostic, and I used some aspects of his interview in the book, and he was a British diplomat in the Middle East who was involved in Afghanistan. I think he quit over the way that some of the elections were being held in Iraq or Afghanistan. And so he's been all over the Middle East as a diplomat, and he became fascinated by these minority religions that have survived in the Middle East. And he points out that actually minority religions didn't survive in the West under Christianity. But even though they were beleaguered all the time, throughout their histories in the Middle East, they survived under Islam. So in that way, Islam was actually kinder to them than the West was to any minority religions that it had. He was saying to me he could, because it's actually quite difficult to get hold of Mandaean scriptures. There's a few academic translations, and most of them haven't been completely translated even. You just can't get hold of a complete version of the Book of John, even though that's it, the translation is in process there, or even at the Ginza. But he was saying, I can understand why. He said, that they wouldn't want people reading their scriptures because some of these very controversial things that are said about Muhammad and Jesus in the scriptures, and he couldn't understand it, why there was so much antipathy towards Islam and Christianity in sections of the scriptures. But I was thinking about that later, and all scriptures are like that, actually. If you look at the New Testament, the way that the Gospel of John treats the Jews, the way that the other Gospels treat the Sadducees and the Pharisees, of course, the attitude that the Quran has to polytheism, and, that it kind of tolerates monotheistic religions and people of the book, but only to a certain extent. And if you look at the Old Testament or Hebrew Bible, those guys didn't like the other religions that were in the area when they were around, and it's full of diatribes against other religions, So there's nothing unusual in the Mandaean scriptures really about that aspect. They're a minority religion, and they have the feeling that in secret, in their own language, they could take pot shots at these other religions that, for the most part, they had to be kowtowing to and bowing their heads to, and trying not to be noticed. And the Mandaeans were very successful at not being noticed through the centuries of history. Hence, their survival.
Yeah, that's not uncommon. I mean, you have in the Talmud and other Jewish writings, they slam Jesus as well. Obviously, even the Gnostic writings are slamming other forms of Christianity and other forms of Gnosticism. So like you said, this is polemics it's a natural part of religions. And moving on to John the Baptist, the Mandeans don't have the view of John the Baptist that traditional Christianity has, right? I mean, even his story is different.
That's right, yeah. That's very weird. I mean, I look at some ways of approaching that in the book, but I'm not quite satisfied that I understand what was going on there. But yeah, the Mandaean John the Baptist, he wasn't beheaded by Herod Antipas, even though that story actually may give an important link to the homeland and the origins of the Mandaeans. Instead, he had loads of kids. I think he travelled with them, and when they're migrating. And I found that fascinating. All the speculation about Jesus, if he was married, if he married Mary Magdalene, and then the whole kind of Holy Blood, Holy Grail, Da Vinci Code kind of thing, that you have the progeny of Jesus and his bloodline coming down through the centuries. But there's nowhere in, the wildest Apocrypha where you find the name of Jesus' child, or even a suggestion that Jesus had a child. Whereas in the Mandaean writings, you have this list of, 7 or 8 kids that he had in their names.
He was more like Joseph Smith.
So, it's a very different view. And in the Ginza, actually, there's a long list of sayings attributed to John the Baptist, one of which, at a push, you could think, okay, this could fit in with the first century John the Baptist, most of which sound pretty mundane in their concerns, that kind of thing. But, there's actually, apart from a few offhand sayings and responses in the Gospels, there's nothing, there are no words attributed to John the Baptist, really, in Scripture, apart from, the stuff in the Mandaean writings. So that's, and then I kind of, my approach to this, when I was, looking at the relationship between Jesus and John the Baptist and the Christian claims and the Mandaean claims, I decided I was going to be very harsh on the Christian claims. And of course, you have a couple of centuries of scholarship digging into the New Testament and analyzing it, tearing it apart, and, some brilliant minds trying to work out what's going on there. And I'm quite influenced by the work of Stephen Davis, or Stephen Davies, as I guess it's pronounced in USA. And I published his book, Spirit Possession and the Origins of Christianity. And basically, his approach is, it's not quite a mythicist approach, not suggesting that Jesus originated as a spiritual entity or a mythic entity and then got historicized, but rather that hardly anything in the Gospels, when you analyze it, seems to be historical anyway. But there probably was a figure at the bottom of it, and I like his sort of spirit possession view that Jesus was, a spirit-possessed teacher whose life wasn't important in itself, except as the way in which he could communicate the techniques of spirit possession to his disciples, and then all the stuff gets made up in terms of explaining what's going on. The different episodes in the Gospels and everything. Anyway, so much work has been done on the Gospels, analysing them, dissecting them, that it's pretty easy to argue that there's hardly anything there that you would say is historical. And also in Josephus, who wrote the History of the Jews and Antiquities of the Jews, what's known as the testimony, this little sentence about Jesus saying that he was a good man, and all that kind of stuff. There've been so many attempts to try and show that, okay, as it stands, that sounds very Christian, and it couldn't have been written by Josephus, but there's probably a historical core to it. Actually, so much more work has been done on that. It's unlikely that it's anything more than an interpolation, and it doesn't exist in some copies of Josephus as well. So we don't have an account of Jesus in Josephus, but there's much stronger evidence that the little bit about John the Baptist in Josephus is authentic. So John the Baptist is a bit more historical than Jesus, and also we have accounts of John the Baptist in the Gospels. So those accounts weren't written by followers of John the Baptist; they were written by followers of Jesus, and so they represent exactly what we don't have for Jesus. The writings of a rival organization describing him. We don't have that in the first century for Jesus. So combining that with a sort of kind attitude to what's going on in the Mandean scriptures, the Mandaeans in a way have almost more of a chance of more of an argument that they go back to John the Baptist than Christians do that they go back to Jesus. Now, I'm being a little bit wicked there, but given that Christianity became this world religion, and fairly early on became so influential, there's so much money in it, which meant that there were so many copies of Christian writings were made and everything. So in comparison, we have this small ethnic group who have migrated from their place of origin, who are trying to survive in what's now Iraq and Iran, and trying not to make themselves too noticeable to other religious groups in the area, trying to accommodate themselves to the culture around them without losing their own integrity and their own individual identities. So, the fact that we have any scriptures for them whatsoever is amazing. So, we don't have little fragments of manuscripts that go back to the 2nd and 3rd centuries at all. But we do actually have evidence within the manuscripts of the Mandaean scriptures of a long tradition of these scriptures being copied. And this is something that, again, we owe our gratitude to Jorunn Buckley, the Norwegian American scholar, who's such a Mandaean expert and friend of the Mandaeans. And she went through the colophons for all of the Mandaean manuscripts that she could find. And I have to explain, a colophon is like a title of the manuscript that's put at the end, but it can also have comments by the scribe. And sometimes you have important little historical footnotes, like in the 19th century when the cholera epidemic was wiping out the Mandaean priesthood. Have comments by scribes at the time about what was going on, how many people are left, and all that kind of stuff. But they also say, I copied this from so-and-so, who copied it from so-and-so, who copied it from so-and-so, and this long list of attributions that you can tie together, and occasionally there'll be another one of these historical footnotes, so you can anchor a particular scribe to a particular century or a particular generation historically. So when you do that, you can go all the way back to the 3rd and even right on the edge of the kind of 2nd century, and some of these most ancient scribes were female as well, which is very encouraging for modern Mandaeans, modern Mandaean women trying to accommodate themselves to new conditions in the West and everything, and encountering feminism and trying to find new ways of relating to their religion. So you can trace certain of the manuscripts all the way back, and given that this is such a tiny group of people, and there's been so little interest over the centuries in them, it's remarkable. So I do my best to kind of stake a claim for the continuity of Mandaean tradition back to John the Baptist, and arguing that perhaps our evidence for John the Baptist is better than our evidence for Jesus is.
You make a very good case. It was Umberto Eco in his novel Falcom's Pendulum, who talks about when you talk to a lunatic, he will always bring up the Knights Templar. So asking from one lunatic to another, what is the connection of the Mandaeans and the Knights Templar?
Well, well, that's something you'll come across regularly, well, particularly on the internet, an association between the Mandaeans and the Knights Templars. And yes, Umberto Eco, he has that sentence, however it goes, everything everywhere is connected to the Templars, however that goes, And, it's actually become a cliche to include that in a book on the Templars. As I mentioned, every book on the Templars now quotes Foucault's Pendulum. So some of the more interesting links that were being suggested there is Lynn Picknett and Clive Prince, in their book The Templar Revelation, they kind of argue that there was an underground church in the south of France that had links to John the Baptist, and that John the Baptist was a sort of alternative Messiah, and that this was a heresy that was going on. Now, I found the material really interesting, and I actually, they're some of my favourite alternative history researchers, and they did some great work, deconstructing what was going on with the pre-read Sion and everything. But I wasn't really convinced that there was this underground church of John the Baptist and Mary Magdalene going on there. But so they suggest a link to the Mandaeans, and then in other places, you'll see these suggestions like the Mandaeans have a ritual handshake, so the Templars did too, and then that goes to the Freemasons. And although the Mandaeans were typically in Iraq and Iran, and of course the Templars were in Syria and going down to on the coast, going down to Jerusalem, it's not impossible they could have encountered each other, because in Damascus there's the Church of St. John the Baptist there is reputed to be somewhat sacred to the Mandaeans as well. Even though John the Baptist isn't beheaded in Mandaean scripture, and his head is, I think, meant to be in the church there, somehow, it's still, as a place that's sacred to the John the Baptist, it's said to be important to the Mandaeans as well. I haven't verified that independently, actually, but anyway, that's how it goes. So so there are all these kind of odd links, and one of the most interesting was the shroud. There is suggestive evidence, I mean, not absolute evidence, but suggestions that the Templars possessed the shroud for a while, and there was certainly they were relic hunters, and there was a massive trade in relics, and the Templars had possessed all sorts of saints' fingers and holy foreskins and all that kind of stuff, which is kind of I always have mixed feelings about this stuff. If you grow up in sort of rationalist secular culture, these sort of things are often quoted as being the most ridiculous, superstitious side of Christianity, and then most of these relics, when they're tested, don't come from the time that they're meant to. You get a finger of John the Baptist that could only go back to the 12th century or something like that. On the other hand, they have magical significance to them, and I like that side of it. So it's one of those things I'm very ambiguous about. But anyway, so the shroud, okay, there's this quite fairly likely connection to the Templars. But then there was an English lady who's an art lecturer who believed that the shroud was a Mandaean shroud, and that myrtle plants, which are an important part of the Mandaean rituals, were represented on the shroud. And so this was the shroud of Jesus, the Mandaean, and he'd been buried by the Mandaeans, and the shroud had survived and everything. Which, when you start to think of it, there's several things that are kind of wrong there. I mean, death rituals are very important to the Mandaeans, and you have to be in a particular robe when you die and everything. Certain things have to be done so that the soul will ascend to the light world properly. But, Jesus was an apostate Mandaean, so we were meant to have Mandaeans taking him down from the cross and wrapping him in myrtle branches and the shroud. And then, since the Mandaeans think that Jesus is an apostate and is kind of responsible for corrupting the religion, and why on earth is this shroud can be kept for so centuries, And anyway, it's one of those great ideas that I always want to include and give them a fair crack of the whip. But if I'm not convinced, I'm going to say so. But anyway, it's great fun being able to discuss the Templars again. I didn't manage to give them much space in the book about the Cathars, but they, with the and of course the other thing is John the Baptist. Of course, that was one of the curious things with the Cathars, that John the Baptist is an important sort of patron to the Templars, but for the Cathars, he represented the baptism of the Catholic Church, this inauthentic baptism, whereas the baptism by the Holy Spirit and fire, that was the real baptism that they had with the Consolamentum ritual. So the Cathars are at odds with the Mandaeans on that, who say that John the Baptist was the real guy. It was nice to discuss the Templars again, and of course, lots of mainstream scholars argue that there wasn't anything strange about the religion of the Templars at all. It was just a form of Catholicism, and when they were arrested and they were being tortured, and they made up a lot of the stuff, But I think there was some esoteric stuff going on with the Templars, probably not the kind of stuff that subsequent esoteric groups have attributed to them. But there's enough that's mysterious with them to be able to explore that. And also, the Templars did have contact with the assassins, the Ismaili assassins. That's historical, definitely historical. They came to a truce at some points. They were living in the same part of Syria, so there was a connection with the assassins. So if the Templars were going to get suspicious foreign esoteric doctrines from anywhere, I think it'd be the assassins rather than the Mandaeans.
To end, Andrew, and we brought this up towards the beginning of the interview, how is the plight of the Mandaeans today? As you said, it is getting better.
Yes, it is somewhat better. I think after the Western intervention, or invasion, depending on which side you want to back, in Iraq, the Mandaeans did suffer a lot of persecution, and a lot of them became refugees. There were attempts at forced conversions, forced circumcision by extremist Islamists, and murders. I think the Mandaeans, typically fairly well-off people, because they've worked as silversmiths and stuff like shipwrights. So they've had certain professions, typically throughout the ages. So the silversmiths were getting raided and having the materials and money stolen, all this kind of stuff. And some really nasty stuff happening there. And of course, on the religious side, with the sort of Mandaeans having to flee the country or move to different areas of Iraq, the communities, which were already very small and very secularized, were breaking up. So there are all sorts of problems with keeping the religion going in the West, like using what river you can use for the weekly baptisms, and whether you can erect the Mandi, the cult hut, which is which is necessary for doing the weekly baptisms in a public park, if you get permission for those and all those sorts of things, and also with a declining number of people able to read the Mandaic language. So those were the problems that they were facing after Saddam Hussein was deposed in Iraq, and they were relatively well treated under Saddam Hussein. I think because he was particularly out to get the Shia Muslims who lived in the same area in the southern marshes as the Mandaeans did. So they kind of benefited by, in comparison, that they were somewhat tolerated just because they weren't Shia Muslims. I think there were several different, reasons. Even though, Saddam was a murderous despot responsible for killing hundreds and thousands more, of his own people. There's no way around that. But their conditions actually worsened after the Western intervention. So that seems to have quieted down a bit, and these minority religions have seats in the Iraqi parliament now. So the Mandaeans have a seat to represent them, and but now the more recent problems are, with ISIS, Daesh, whatever you want to call them, and the Yazidis have had a lot of publicity because they've been through so many horrendous things themselves. But so the Yazidis are getting a certain amount of aid and everything, and they've actually befriended Mandaeans, and they've been working together. The situation isn't as bad as it was a few years ago, and you can still get annual reports on human rights abuses in Iraq as they affect Mandaeans. You can find those online. But there's, with the whole thing with ISIS, ISIL, Daesh, that's really very nasty. And that, and in fact, the Wadi Haran, which is a contender for an early location of as the homeland of the Mandaeans, that seems to be an ISIS stronghold at the moment. But you get things like Yazidi and Mandaean women get kidnapped by ISIS, and they actually, the Mandaeans and Yazidis, raising funds within Iraq so they can pay off ransoms to get the women returned. That's the kind of stuff that's going on. Whereas, for example, in Australia, I think the Mandaean community there is probably the strongest in the West. They seem to be having a more settled community there. You can see online that they have sort of youth groups where young people can learn about their traditions, and that's actually been a problem with the Mandaean communities. I think back in 1970, a scholar predicted that the Mandaean religion wouldn't last for another generation, but they're still going, and they were very secularized in Iraq, and the religion follows a similar pattern to many of these minority religions in the Middle East. That they are esoteric religions. The lay people just know a few different practices and a little bit of the scriptures, whereas the priesthood have an awful lot of esoteric knowledge and traditions that are communicated just within the priesthood. So the challenge is, for those traditions to be passed down in the priesthood, and then for modern, secularized Mandaeans to reclaim their own religion and traditions, which they seem to be very enthusiastic in doing. And it's still quite difficult to make much contact with Mandaeans. They do like to keep themselves to themselves, and who knows if there's an Iraqi in your city, perhaps he's a Mandaean, who knows?
Who knows, and definitely hope the situation gets better, and glad to see that things are getting better. As you write in your book, Gnosticism is a religion of the underdog, and the Mandeans have been the underdogs, and we hope they survive and thrive and continue. But I think that's all the time we have today, Andrew. I'd like to thank you very much for coming on Aeon Byte and discussing your latest book, John the Baptist and the Last Gnostics.
Thank you very much for having me, Miguel.